tension between access and establishing some sort of control over any technology is as old as the technologies itself. The developing states, their sustainable development is very much linked with the opportunities to access and peacefully develop technologies for the beneficial purposes.
Similar challenges, I'm sure, must have been faced by other countries. I'd like to know how other countries have surmounted these challenges and developed a stable and mutually acceptable cyber governance system. Pakistan is currently facing a major security concern in terms of fake propaganda and disinformation being waged on social media from overseas territories. So how does Pakistan view that in terms of its cyber concerns?
Access that no undue constraints is something that we have been championing along with many other states as well.
What sort of support Pakistan is enjoying or expects to have from the international community? If weaponization of information is also being discussed in international multilateral diplomacy and negotiations, and if so, how so?
Some of the ideas that Pakistan has put forward in the conversation have largely resonated.
Welcome to V News English. Today we are starting a new program, Perspectives, in which we'll go beyond the clutter of news and beneath the misinformation and disinformation to bring to you insightful, informed, respectable, and credible analysis based on diverse perspectives from around the world on issues that affect all of you, ranging from international security, international economy, geopolitics, human security, international law, and everything else. In today's episode, in our first program, we are pleased to join by two of the most distinguished authorities who specialize in two of the key areas affecting international security: international diplomacy and international law, to discuss and decipher the emerging issue of cyber governance, which, ladies and gentlemen, is currently at the center of the storm between Pakistani government, state, and judiciary. So we'll try to understand how this issue of cyber governance is being dealt with in the world, in some of the most modern countries. What are the lessons for us, and how can we benefit from them? But also, how do the traditional notions and concepts of privacy and freedom of speech are deeply and permanently being affected by the emerging technologies? So today, we are joined by Mr. Hisham Ahmed, who's perhaps one of Pakistan's finest diplomat. He's counselor at Geneva on arms control and disarmament issues at the Pakistan mission at the United Nations. He specializes in arms control issues ranging from nuclear, biological, chemical, outer space, and emerging technologies. He has been participating in international negotiations at the group of governmental experts on lethal and autonomous weapon systems. Earlier, he has served with distinction as Director Arms Control at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Islamabad. And our second guest, to help us understand the complexities of international law and the requirements of improving our governance structure, is another young and emerging star on Pakistan's international law small fraternity, Awais Anwar. He's currently serving as Director Research at the Research Society of International Law. He's an Eisenhower Global Fellow and a member of National Security Division's working group of experts on public international law. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. So I'll start with our young diplomat, Hisham Ahmed, who's joining us from Geneva. at the United Nations. So, Mr. Hasham, first, please introduce us to the concept of cyber governance. How old is this concept, and what is the basis for coming up with such a complex concept? Why it was needed?
It's a pleasure to be in the company of another esteemed panelist. So, cyber governance, just like other new and emerging technologies, it's a subject that has been in the multilateral discourse for a while now, for decades. In fact, as soon as the age of internet arrived, the discussions on relating to threats, relating to the ICT, or what is known as information and communication infrastructure, the conversation on that also evolved, and many countries started highlighting the risks and what kind of measures that would be required to address those risks. So when it comes to cyber domain, recently this discussion has intensified since at least 2004, when the first UN group of governmental expert was formed on cybersecurity. It's basically a small group composing 15 to 25 member states who get together for a couple of years, and they argue on how different threats would impact international security in the cyber domain and what kind of risks mitigation measures are required. And when we talk about governance, and I think there are various kind of instruments that have been proposed, different tools ranging from legally binding instruments or treaties to non-legally binding norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior that have often been pushed by the large majority of states to set up adequately effective governance structures to deal with the threats.
Okay, that brings me to an interesting question. That you are an expert on arms control, multilateral diplomacy, and you're well aware that several such treaties in the last 75, 80 years, are a victim of monopoly of a few states who enjoy disproportionate access and influence over strategically relevant technologies, while denying the benefits of these technologies to a large number of developing countries. So do you think this aspect of geopolitics, of dividing the world between haves and have-nots in terms of emerging technologies and cyber security, is also similar in this case, or do you think we have learned some lessons?
That's an important aspect that you have highlighted. And this debate on the tension between access and establishing some sort of control over any technology is as old as the technologies itself. And as we have discussions in the field of new and emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, like cyber related infrastructure and communication technologies, we are again having this discussion in various places that whatever governance structures or norms or rules and principles are set up, they should be set up in an inclusive manner. And for the developing states, the most important aspect is that they should be facilitated and enabled to harvest those technologies for peaceful purposes, for sustainable development purposes. If we look at any arms control treaty from the period of 20th century, Cold War, we would find this aspect of promotional aspect of development of technologies and implementation of these technologies for peaceful purposes in almost every treaty. And I think this promotional aspect will be an essential component in the future governance structures as well. I cannot foresee establishing control parameters on any new technology without addressing its peaceful civilian or development side. And I think the most important aspect is that because most of the technologies that we have dealt in the past are dual use technologies. So while they do carry risks on the military side, if they are unregulated, if they fall into the hands of non-state actors, at the same time, the developing states, their sustainable development is very much linked with the opportunities to access and peacefully develop technologies for their beneficial purposes.
Thank you. Let me bring in Awais into this discussion. Awais, all the UN countries are party and signatory to the UN Charter, which guarantee access to information, privacy, and freedom of speech. So, in your view, don't you think that these traditional rights and notions have been overtaken by time with the advent of technology, or do you think states can still provide their citizens the right of privacy at the time when national security is also a grave concern by most countries, especially after 9/11?
Thank you very much, Sab, for inviting me, and I'm glad to be sharing the panel with Sham. This is a great question that you've raised. We're looking at, an evolution of rights, and we certainly can't look at rights in a vacuum. The rights that we have, say, enshrined in the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, or in the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, these aren't time-bound, or they're not specific to a particular era, a particular context. These are general rights that are given not because of the circumstances, but because of human beings, because of people being inherently human. And those rights, therefore, cannot be curtailed because of, change in circumstances as such. What we do, however, need to see is, can there be an evolution of these rights? And does there need to be an evolution? And certainly with the advent of new technologies, there's no doubt that these rights are going to be modified. If we, see the advent of artificial intelligence and the impact that is having on issues, we see this proliferation of misinformation and disinformation across the world. How are we going to ensure that the same rights that we're trying to protect are still there? The substance is still there. So really looking at it, when we look at cyber governance in general, what we're actually talking about is the regulation of the flow of information, right? So it is this flow of information that is being regulated, is being governed, and we do this through different models across the world, through different international mechanisms as well as domestic mechanisms. And there's entirely a very rich body that has been dealing with this for centuries, and it's not just a modern phenomenon. So what is justified speech, for example? What is lawful speech and what is unlawful speech, more particularly? But in addition to this, what we need to understand, I think, is that, for example, your Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights guarantees that everyone shall have the right of freedom of expression. This includes freedom to seek, receive, and impart information, right? And there are very limited circumstances in which this can be restricted. Right, so some of the obvious ones, there could be censorship for purposes of, national security. So the classification of documents that we see, top secret, etc. We can't allow national secrets to be out. So things like official secrets, the Official Secrets Act, that is another example of a reasonable, justified restriction of the free flow of information. But we start from the point that the flow of information is a positive thing, that human beings deserve this. In fact, it's so positive that we believe it is a public good, and secondly, it is a right inherent to people, that they deserve to this.
So let me ask you another question, that when you talk about cyber governance, you imply that despite the advent of technology, and in particular cyber technology, the traditional rights and notions of privacy, freedom of expression, and secrecy can be balanced, and have been successfully managed by different states in terms of their governance structures. Can you cite a few examples?
Absolutely. So coming into this, when we're talking about the flow of information, reasonable restrictions to this flow of information, to this actual right, they are provided not only, governments don't just do this, it's provided within the ICCPR itself, right? So if we go on to read the exercise of the rights provided in paragraph 2, for example, they can only be curtailed through law and they must be necessary. And on what grounds? respect of the rights and reputation of others. So when we talk about defamation laws, you can't simply destroy the reputation of another person based on disinformation, by lying, right? It has to be based on factual things. Secondly, for the protection of national security or of public order or public health or morals. So these are grounds which are justified under the international mechanism and certainly under domestic laws. Reasonable restrictions there. Now, the problem that arises that we see throughout the world is who defines these restrictions. What is, for example, national security? What exactly is national security? We're not talking about a vague notion, because as a lawyer, for example, vague notions are very problematic, because then anybody could bring a definition. So who does this and how do they do this? Is Parliament involved in making this determination? Is it a democratic process? Are the people involved? So we can have a number of examples. In our own backyard in Pakistan, for example, we very clearly have laws that regulate defamation. We have laws that regulate things like blasphemy. We have laws that look at religious sentiments across the board, and we prohibit that type of speech. More importantly, we have laws that prohibit glorification of terrorism or hate speech or the incitement of violence. And people may say that this is a restriction on freedom of expression, but this is exactly the type of restriction that is reasonable and justified under international, as well as
recently we have witnessed sort of a tension between different state institutions in Pakistan as well, between judiciary, between government and state, in terms of interpretation of national security, privacy, and also national security. Do you think similar challenges, I'm sure, must have been faced by other countries? I'd like to know how other countries have surmounted these challenges and developed a stable and mutually acceptable cyber governance system. Can you cite a few examples?
Certainly. So, specific examples that you're looking at, if we look at the United States, for example, the mechanism that they have to, so let's start off from the position that everyone has a right to privacy, right? That right to privacy, a reasonable expectation of privacy, this is something that you can have in your own home. To go beyond that, to be able to violate this right or infringe upon this right, the state imposes certain restrictions on, say, law enforcement agencies or intelligence agencies. They have to obtain a warrant. So there has to be some level of judicial oversight, as well as some level of parliamentary or, the House of Representatives or, the Senate in the US. There has to be some parliamentary oversight as well. And these are things that we see.
Let me interrupt you to ask a specific question. For example, NSA gains data which is private for an individual, or MI6 gets some information in the UK, or Mossad gets some information of its citizens in Israel, or RAW gets some information about an individual which he might consider private in India. How does that access and responsibility to protect their respective national security interests is balanced with the right of privacy of an individual?
So again, if I could, just discuss that, what we're looking at is the intelligence agencies are a realm that is not fully governed by legislation, for example. And we see lots of actions that are taking place, around the world that aren't necessarily governed by legislation, or even when they are governed by legislation, there isn't effective oversight to ensure that they do what is required under the law. But what we see is that because of the imperative of national security, we allow that leeway, that gray area to exist, right? And that's what we see the world over, whether it is in those things. It's only in the realm when you want to take the information that is obtained by violating, say, privacy, and use it for trial purposes, use it in a court, make it admissible evidence. That is where the requirement to obtain a warrant comes in. We can see in Pakistan, for example, we have the Investigation for Fair Trial Act, which gives an elaborate procedure of how to do that. But other than that, whether it's India, whether it's Israel or the US, the UK, we have a very elaborate intelligence gathering mechanisms, which routinely, for the purposes of national security, do violate privacy. But that is often done on foreign intelligence entities. For domestic, operations, there's severe limitations that are imposed by constitutions, by domestic legislation. And so making the analogy between foreign intelligence and domestic intelligence really is not there. It needs to be bifurcated clearly there.
Okay, let me go back to Hisham. Hisham, when you talk about the cutting edge of the global debate on developing an international cyber governance regime or system, who is spearheading this debate? What are the most critical issues which such negotiations are facing? And what are the convergences and divergences between states on these issues?
So there are many areas in which the multilateral discourse is taking place when it comes to cybersecurity. And currently, for instance, there is a working group which is meeting in New York that was established in 2021, and it has a 5-year period, and it is working in many streams. For instance, there is convergence that international humanitarian law would apply in any cyber conflict, but there remains differences on how that IHL would be, how the individual provisions of IHL would be implemented. Those principles, for instance, relating to precaution, distinction, proportionality, how they would actually translate in the cyber domain. That kind of conversation is taking place. Then, for instance, if the states are advised not to target anyone's other state's critical infrastructure, then the discussion is taking place. What would come under that critical infrastructure? Would that include only basic infrastructure facilities that are delivering some important functions to the citizens of a state? Would it include military installations as well? Then challenges relating to attribution are also being discussed, that what would be the basic parameters that should be followed, principles should be established in order to have some degree of confidence in terms of attribution of a cyber attack. Then, for instance, how the other principles or tenets of international law would apply in cyber domain. There is convergence that there should be non-use of force in the cyber domain. There should be principle of non-intervention that should be adhered to. Peaceful settlement of disputes should also be adhered to in the cyber domain. So these kind of conversations are taking place. There are convergences on broad principles. Let's just say that international law applies, IHL applies. But when we start getting into the details on how those specific principles of international law or IHL, the humanitarian law, would be interpreted or implemented, and who will, for instance, decide in any dispute between the two states, what will constitute as a cyber attack, what would be that threshold, for instance. So those are the conversations in which there remain different opinions. Many states, a vast majority of states, including Pakistan, are advocating for formulation of a legally binding instrument, a treaty that can not only promote the responsible behavior of states in cyberspace, but it can regulate the use of cyber and other digital technologies. And we believe that in terms of developing a legally binding instrument, it would further facilitate the interpretation and consistent application of international legal principles, as opposed to, for instance.
Hisham, I'll ask a brief question, both of yourself and if Wes wants to add to that. Is the role of information also considered part of this debate on cybersecurity and cyber governance, or is it considered a separate issue? Because obviously, Pakistan is currently facing a major security concern in terms of fake propaganda and disinformation being waged on social media from overseas territories. So how does Pakistan view that in terms of its cyber concerns? First Hisham and then Wes.
Thank you. I think the lines are still very blurry when it comes to establishing boundaries of what would be included in the cybersecurity domain, what would be parked under the cyber crime, for instance, infrastructure, what is linked with security, and what is going to be purely something that is for civilian purposes and not linked with hardcore security. But these are some of the conversations that are taking place. For instance, the open-ended working group that I talked about, the title of that working group is the Open-Ended Working Group on Information and Communication Technologies, ICTs. So the malicious use of information, the nefarious use of information to advance certain security-related objectives, it is certainly a discourse that has been taken up in the Open-Ended Working Group on how, in a crisis setting, for instance, disinformation could play a very critical role in terms of escalation dynamics, or in terms of determining the trajectory of a crisis. So these are conversations that are happening. However, there is little convergence in terms of the establishing the boundaries of that governance structure.
Wes, you want to add something to that?
Absolutely. I think we need to be very clear on the fact that this is a global phenomenon. The fact that information is being weaponized in the sense that there's misinformation, disinformation. Certainly, we've seen numerous attempts, targeting Pakistan, but Pakistan is not the only country in the world. We've seen, Russian influence of U.S. elections in the past. We've seen this happen all around the world. So this isn't something that is unique to Pakistan. Number one.
Can you explain how other countries who have faced this experience, like Pakistan before, dealt with it in terms of cyber governance?
So there are numerous mechanisms. For example, you can bring in mechanisms to fact check, right? The use of artificial intelligence to, if you're not fact checking, or if you can't, one solution that X, or formerly known as Twitter, has, is that they have community notes. So when there's disinformation, the community as a whole can vote in and put in clarification of information there. Now that's somewhat.
What about the legal and diplomatic options?
So from a legal perspective, we haven't seen really the criminalization of cross-border disinformation, if you will, right? This isn't something that has developed as yet. We haven't seen, we've seen to some extent a liability being imposed on publishers and platforms such as X or Facebook, Meta, organizations like this. That trend might actually develop. But we haven't seen anything concrete as such. What we need to, however, address is, Alisam, if you let me finish this point, is that the solutions that need to be, that are imposed have to be necessary, first of all, because that's what the requirement under international law is. And by necessary, we also mean proportionate, right? So blanket ban on platforms is not really a solution there. Because what you do is that you remove the public good aspect of information, which is, it is, you can't exclude individuals from it. It's non-rivalrous as well. And those, what essentially does is that when you impose such blanket bans, you restrict information to the haves, right? And it is, individuals who don't have, for example, VPNs, or who don't have access to advanced technology or other things, that lose that access to information and technology, and therefore, it impacts their rights there.
Okay, Hisham, can you briefly explain if weaponization of information is also being discussed in international multilateral diplomacy and negotiations, and if so, how so?
Absolutely. When it comes to weaponization of information or disinformation as well, these are the concepts that have been taken up in various places throughout the UN structure. There are various resolutions which recall the risks of the disinformation in various settings. However, there, as I pointed out earlier, in terms of the governance structures, in terms of the measures that are required to address that, that part and component is still very much under development. For instance, if you look in the cyberspace side, the voluntary norms that have been agreed upon so far by this working groups in the past as well, the principles of responsible behavior, they talk about mostly they call upon the states not to use information for malicious purposes to target the critical infrastructure, for instance, of other states, and to share and exchange information in different cases as well, critical information that could be useful in terms of fighting any incident, a terrorism related incident. So there are some certain soft norms that are being, of course, developed and socialized. And there are capacity building courses and workshops taking place in different regions to build capacities in different states on how those broad principles would actually be implemented in the ground by various stakeholders. What would be the mechanism of exchange of information between different states? Those information structures, those structures are still being set up. For instance, just this year, the UN Working Group agreed to set up points of contact directory from different states. That means there will be a point of contact for each state who will be able to contact each other and share information with each other at a very short notice whenever it's required. So those kind of conversations are taking place, resulting in some outcomes at a much slower pace than what many would have desired, but at least some developments happen.
Okay, my last question, Nisham, is that what are the major Pakistani concerns regarding cyber governance, and what sort of support Pakistan is enjoying or expects to have from the international community in developing a mutually acceptable international cyber governance regime?
So Pakistan has been playing a very active role in the conversations in the open-ended working group on the cybersecurity. We have put forward some very detailed proposals in various themes that are being considered in the working group. Broadly, for instance, as I mentioned, we, along with a large majority of states, have been calling for legally binding treaties to be developed and formulated. At the same time, we have put forward some ideas on the table in terms of what would be required for capacity building for many states, many developing states, including in the areas of data security, for instance. Then the issue of access, that no undue constraints, is something that we have been championing along with many other states as well. And some of the ideas that Pakistan has put forward in the conversation have largely resonated with the developing states, with the global south, and also with the major capability-driven states as well. They do acknowledge that there is a need, of course, for capacity building if we want to develop an inclusive structure, governance structure, in which everybody can participate and everybody has the ability to implement those principles. Then you would need to take everybody along with you while leaving no one behind.
Prasham, I share your optimism and really appreciate your dedicated effort as a leading diplomat of Pakistan's Foreign Service. However, I think the transforming world order and the geopolitics might constrain your efforts. But realistically, do you actually foresee the emergence of a global, internationally acceptable cyber governance regime in the foreseeable future?
My view would be that the cyberspace would remain to be a contested domain in the at least immediate future. While there is a call for legally binding instruments, we do see that some important players are averse to negotiating any new treaties at this point in time. However, this does not preclude that the areas which are important to countries, developing states like Pakistan, could not be highlighted or championed or advocated in these discussions. And I think it's important, the point that you have highlighted, that highlights the importance of not only being engaged in these multilateral conversations, but also to talk with our partners, other stakeholders, in developing and setting up effective mechanisms in-house as well in order to develop capabilities that would be required to ward off any threats in cyber domain. And this is, I think, the urgency of this has come for on many occasions.
Hisham and Awais, thank you so much for joining us today to help us understand how technology is upsetting the world and our ways of life. It's a fascinating challenge. It offers lots of opportunities, but today the world is different from our earlier generations. So there are four takeaways today, ladies and gentlemen, from this very vibrant and well-informed discourse today. Number one, technology is changing the world and the lives of the people like never before at an accelerated pace. Secondly, it is posing huge and enormous challenges to the traditional concepts of privacy, freedom of information, and national security, which all states must surmount. Number three, there's great scope and opportunity for learning from each other and cooperating with each other in order to undo some of the inequalities that earlier strategically relevant technologies have promoted in the last century. And lastly, I think we all, at an individual level, at a state level, and international level, need to be responsible, need to be careful in the exercise of our individual right and expectations as a global citizen. Thank you very much for joining us today on this first episode of Perspectives. Keep watching, and we'll keep bringing you more informed, vibrant, and candid discourse on the most important issues that affect all of us. Thank you for joining us.